The moment came like a lightning strike, sharp, unexpected, unforgettable. Colbert leaned back in his chair, lips curling into that trademark smirk he so often wielded as a weapon. He had just fired off another quip, another sarcastic jab designed to draw laughs at someone else's expense. But before the chuckle of the audience could even settle into full laughter, Denzel Washington leaned forward, eyes steady, voice calm, and dropped a line that cut through the noise like a blade through silk. "You mistake laughter for truth, Stephen, and that's why you're losing people." The room froze. It wasn't the kind of silence late-night television is built for. This wasn't comedic timing, nor the deliberate pause of a joke waiting for applause. This was the silence of a crowd realizing they had just witnessed a collision, an unscripted fracture in the smooth veneer of entertainment. Colbert's smile faltered, a microsecond too long for cameras to miss. His usual arsenal, irony, deflection suddenly seemed brittle, almost hollow. He tried to let the smirk hold, but even in the flood of studio lights, the unease flickered across his face. The audience sat suspended between worlds. They were trained to laugh, conditioned to clap on cue. But this moment didn't fit the rhythm. The applause signs remained dark, the producers behind the cameras frozen as much as the viewers at home would soon be. Denzel didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His words landed with a kind of weight that doesn't need volume to echo. The truth of them filled the air, reverberating in the silence. Colbert's quip had been designed to corner him, but instead, it became the opening for something raw, deeper, and undeniably real. You could see the audience members glance at each other, eyes wide, as though silently asking, did he just say that? Did that really just happen? And it had, live, unrehearsed, in a space where Colbert had always seemed untouchable. Denzel had just seized the ground beneath him. But what led to this moment? How did a guest known for grace and dignity deliver a blow so sharp that it left one of television's sharpest tongues speechless? And why, in the hours and days that followed, would millions replay this single sentence as if it were history itself? The answer lies in the build-up, the clash of two worlds, two styles, two visions of truth colliding under the hottest lights in America. To understand the gravity of what unfolded, we have to rewind the tape, back to the start of the evening. Before the silence, before the shift, the stage was Colbert's kingdom. He was the jester who ruled with sarcasm, the late-night king who blended politics with punchlines and packaged it all as entertainment. For years, his audience had relied on him to be the sharp-tongued truth-teller, the man who could deflate egos with a single smirk and win the crowd with a rehearsed jab. He thrived on control, his wit, his stage, his rules, and for a long time, that formula worked. In a media landscape fractured by politics and culture wars, Colbert carved out his throne by making fun of power. But somewhere along the way, the line blurred. The comedy that once humbled politicians and moguls began to shift into something else, a theater of arrogance, where guests were foils, and the laughs came not from shared truth, but from humiliation disguised as satire. That's the Colbert who sat across from Denzel Washington that night. Confident, cocky, certain that another segment would go exactly the way his team had scripted it. Denzel would give the polished, charming answers. Colbert would prod in pokey, spinning moments into laughs, keeping himself at the center. The audience would clap. The headlines the next morning would celebrate another night of clever banter. It was supposed to be routine, just another roast dressed up as late-night conversation. But Denzel Washington was not just another guest. This was a man forged by discipline, faith, and the hard edges of reality. A man who had risen from modest beginnings, not by performing for approval, but by commanding respect. He had built the career on characters who stood unshaken in the face of storms, and off-screen he carried himself with the same gravitas. While Colbert's world thrived on laughter, Denzel's rested on something far heavier, truth. That contrast was the spark waiting for ignition. Because when a man who deals in mockery meets a man who deals in dignity, the stage doesn't stay balanced for long. And there was another layer, the cultural weight of late-night television itself. In America, these shows weren't just comedy, they were platforms. Stages where narratives about politics, race, and identity were spun night after night. Millions tuned in not only to laugh, but to be told who to laugh at. For some, Colbert was a guide, a comfort, a voice that made sense of chaos with a joke. But for others, his smirk was a reminder of how often truth gets buried under sarcasm. That night, the studio audience expected more of the same. They expected the rhythm they'd come to know, Colbert's jabs, a few self-deprecating chuckles from Denzel, the applause sign lighting up on cue. But the rhythm broke. Because the setup was perfect for Colbert at this time. His punchlines hit a wall they couldn't crack. Denzel wasn't there to play the foil. He wasn't there to be reduced to another meme for late-night entertainment. He was there as himself, unshaken, unbending, and unwilling to trade dignity for applause. And as the lights blazed and the audience leaned in, none of them realized they were about to witness not another comedy segment, but a collision. A collision so sharp it would echo far beyond that stage. The setup was perfect for Colbert, but he had no idea who he was dealing with. Stephen Colbert built his empire on the razor's edge of sarcasm. For years, He thrived as the man who could turn any topic, no matter how serious, no matter how sacred, into fodder for a laugh. His genius lay not only in quick wit but in the smug certainty with which he delivered it. He wasn't just making jokes, he was declaring ownership over the room. Whether facing a politician, an actor, or a fellow comedian, Colbert had mastered the art of controlling the stage. He knew the rhythm of late night like a conductor knows the symphony. The setup, the smirk, the perfectly timed pause before the punchline. His audience knew their cues. They clapped, they laughed, they cheered, and in that predictable cycle, Colbert reigned supreme. Every guest who sat across from him entered his world, a world where he dictated the pace, the narrative, and the final laugh. And it wasn't just entertainment. Colbert became a cultural figurehead, the late-night voice for liberal America, the commentator who wrapped politics in comedy and presented it as gospel. He built credibility on ridicule, fashioning himself as a truth-teller who could skewer hypocrisy with a smile. But hidden beneath the satire was something more insidious, a dependency on mockery, a reliance on making others small so that he could remain large. This wasn't without controversy. There were moments when his jokes crossed the line, when his monologues veered from clever to cruel. Critics accused him of turning sensitive issues into punchlines, of prioritizing the laugh over the truth. There were interviews where guests left visibly uncomfortable, moments where what should have been a meaningful discussion dissolved into a performance of Colbert's superiority. But time and again, he escaped unscathed. His fans defended him as fearless, his network praised him as indispensable, and the machine of late night rolled on. The audience perception was clear. Stephen Colbert was untouchable, the master of the stage, the man who could face anyone, from senators to superstars, and come out on top. His sharp tongue was his shield, his smirk, the sword he wielded without hesitation. For years, no one had truly challenged that balance. Guests laughed along, or fumbled, or played the role of the foil. The system worked, because no one dared to flip the script, and Colbert thrived on that dynamic. He relished being the cleverest man in the room, the one who always had the final word. His interviews weren't dialogues, they were duels where he controlled both the arena and the rules. To sit across from him was to enter a game you couldn't win, because he always stacked the deck. That's why his downfall in this particular moment was so shocking, because on paper, everything was lined up in his favor. He was on home turf, with his audience primed to cheer his every quip. The cameras, the lighting, the rhythm of the show all tilted in his direction. This was his empire, and Denzel Washington was expected to be another guest who politely played along. But arrogance is a dangerous crown. Over time, Colbert had begun to believe his own invincibility, convinced that no one could puncture the persona he'd crafted. He saw every interview as a stage to reaffirm his dominance, every exchange as another chance to sharpen his brand of smug humor. And in that certainty, he overlooked a truth as old as storytelling itself. Even the cleverest performers are human, and arrogance blinds. That night, when Colbert leaned back in his chair, flashing that familiar grin, he thought he was in control. He thought the rhythm would hold, the audience would laugh, and he would, as always, walk away unchallenged. But beneath the lights, sitting across from him, was a man who didn't play by those rules. And in the seconds to come, Colbert's confidence would be tested in a way it never had before. Yet arrogance blinds the cleverest performers, and Colbert's mask was about to slip. To understand why Denzel Washington's words landed with such seismic force, you have to step back from the glare of the late-night stage and into the story of the man himself. Because unlike Stephen Colbert, who built his career on laughter and performance, Denzel built his life on discipline, faith, and a deep respect for truth. Born in Mount Vernon, New York, the son of a Pentecostal minister and a beauty shop owner, Denzel grew up with a grounding few in Hollywood ever know. His father's strictness and his mother's relentless work ethic carved into him a sense of responsibility that would shape not only his career but his very character. There was no smirk to hide behind in those years, no studio audience to validate every word. There was only discipline, church on Sundays, rules in the home, and the steady voice of a father reminding him that life is not about applause, but about integrity. Denzel often recalls how his mother, after seeing him drift toward trouble as a teenager, sent him away to boarding school. It wasn't a punishment, it was a lifeline. There, away from the temptations of the streets, he found the structure that would anchor him for decades. The boy who might have lost his way instead learned the power of direction. He carried that lesson with him into adulthood, into the stage, and later into film, where every role he chose carried a weight beyond performance. Unlike many in Hollywood, Denzel didn't chase celebrity for its own sake. His career was built not on gimmicks or scandals, but on the gravitas he brought to every character. From Glory to Malcolm X, from Training Day to Fences, his performances were not just entertainment, they were lessons. Audiences walked away not only impressed by his talent, but moved by the authenticity he infused into every line. He didn't just act, he embodied. And off-screen the man matched the roles, known for humility, for his refusal to bend to the shallow culture of Hollywood excess. Denzel became something rare in the world of stars, a figure admired as much for his wisdom as for his talent. When he spoke, whether in interviews, speeches, or commencement addresses, people listened. Not because he was famous, but because he carried the kind of authority that comes from a life lived with principle. His reputation became that of a truth-teller, a man who spoke plainly, often quoting scripture, always rooting his words in something deeper than surface-level applause. When he warned young actors about the dangers of fame, when he spoke about the importance of family, of faith, of self-respect, it wasn't the voice of a performer, it was the voice of a man who had seen both sides of life and chosen the harder, narrower path of dignity. That authenticity set him apart. In an industry often obsessed with image, Denzel's refusal to conform made him a towering figure. He didn't need to play for laughs or force approval. He didn't need to dominate a room with sarcasm. His presence alone commanded respect, which is why the clash with Colbert carried so much weight. On one side sat the jester, smirking beneath the bright lights, reveling in the game of wit. On the other side sat the man of discipline, unshaken, his words measured not for humor, but for truth. It was a contrast as stark as light and shadow. The difference was more than style, it was substance. Colbert's weapon was performance mockery dressed as intelligence. Denzel's weapon was reality hard-earned wisdom sharpened by decades of living, working, and standing tall under pressure. Consider the countless award shows where Denzel, surrounded by glitz and vanity, would step to the microphone and cut through the noise with words that reminded the audience of faith, humility, and legacy. Consider his commencement speech at Dillard University, where he told graduates, "Put God first," or the countless times he has warned of the fleeting nature of fame, grounding his advice not in cynicism but in timeless values. This was a man who had nothing to prove to Stephen Colbert or to anyone else. His legacy was already written in films that would live for generations, in the respective peers who hailed him as one of the greatest actors of all time, in the millions who looked to him not just as an entertainer but as a model of dignity. So when he sat in that chair, opposite Colbert, the audience expected charm, a few laughs, maybe a story or two from his career. They didn't expect confrontation. They didn't expect truth to cut across the comedy. They didn't expect the balance of power in that studio to shift. But Denzel Washington had not come to play Colbert's game. He had come as himself, disciplined, faithful, grounded, and unwilling to trade authenticity for applause. He carried with him the weight of a lifetime of lessons, and in that moment, he wasn't going to shrink beneath a smirk. And when the spotlight turned on him, he would wield not comedy, but truth. The interview began the way so many of Colbert's shows did, light, playful, laced with sarcasm meant to disarm. He opened with a teasing jab at Hollywood, hinting that actors like Denzel live in a world of privilege, detached from the struggles of ordinary Americans. The crowd laughed, almost on autopilot, their loyalty to Colbert's rhythm of setup and punchline undeniable. Denzel, however, didn't flinch. He gave a short, grounded answer. "I work same as anybody else, just in a different field." No elaboration, no laughter, no performance. It was the kind of answer that redirected attention away from comedy and toward reality. The audience chuckled awkwardly, unsure whether to clap or wait for Colbert to twist it back into humor. Colbert smirked, leaning into the discomfort. He thrived on these moments when a guest didn't play along. It gave him the chance to press harder, to show off his wit at their expense. He tossed out another joke, this time about actors being professional liars. The audience roared, expecting Denzel to chuckle along, but instead he replied with calm precision, or maybe professional truth-tellers, depending on how you look at it. The room shifted. A pocket of the audience clapped instinctively, while others held back, waiting for Colbert's counterpunch. He smirked again, but his eyes narrowed. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but the balance of control had shifted, slightly, and he knew it. Determined to win back the rhythm, Colbert leaned forward, voice dripping with mock sincerity. He asked about fame, but framed it as a trap. Wasn't Denzel, with all his success, just another celebrity out of touch with real struggles? The question was bait, designed to force Denzel into either defending himself awkwardly or laughing it off. But once again Denzel refused to play the game. "Fame fades," he said evenly. "Character stays." The words hit harder than expected. They weren't witty, they weren't funny, but they carried weight. A murmur rippled through the audience. Not quite applause, not quite silence, something in between, something unsettled. Colbert chuckled, a nervous edge slipping into his voice. He wasn't used to being stonewalled with truth. Usually, by this point in an interview, the guest was laughing, the audience was roaring, and the segment was sailing along smoothly. Instead, the air felt thick, and every attempt to mock seemed to open the door for Denzel to counter with something deeper. The tension was undeniable now. The laughter came slower, more forced, like the crowd wasn't sure if they were still in on the joke. Colbert, sensing the unease, decided to push harder. His next question came sharper, tinged with mockery disguised as humor. "So tell me, Denzel," he said with a grin that felt more like a challenge, "when you're lecturing all of us about discipline and truth, do you ever hear yourself? Or is it easier to preach when you've already got millions in the bank?" The audience gasped, half laughing, half stunned. It was the kind of line that could sting, a calculated swipe at credibility. Colbert expected it to land as the knockout punch, the moment where the crowd would side with him, the smirk cemented once again as king of the stage. But Denzel didn't laugh. He didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. Instead, he leaned forward, closing the distance between them. His eyes locked directly on Colbert's. The studio lights caught his face, calm but unyielding, as though centuries of discipline and truth were channeled into that single moment. The audience hushed. You could hear the air conditioning hum, the nervous shifting of bodies in the seats. And then, in that silence, Denzel delivered the line that changed everything. The words fell like a hammer, not loud, not rushed, but measured, deliberate in their simplicity. Denzel leaned forward, eyes locked on Colbert, and spoke with a calmness that carried more weight than any raised voice ever could. You mistake laughter for truth, Stephen, and that's why you're losing people. The line cut through the air, stripping the room of its rhythm. For a heartbeat, the audience didn't know what to do. They weren't used to this kind of stillness on a late-night stage. No cue cards told them how to respond. The silence stretched, heavy, unbroken, until the first scattered gasp floated across the studio. Colbert's smirk wavered. For years, that grin had been his armor, the unshakable symbol of his dominance over the room. But now it faltered, the corners twitching as if even his face understood the blow it had taken. He let out a forced laugh, the kind that didn't come from amusement but from desperation, a flimsy attempt to reclaim control. Denzel didn't move. He didn't laugh. He didn't fill the silence with nervous chatter. He simply held the gaze, his presence steady, his voice still echoing in the ears of everyone watching. The power wasn't in the volume, it was in the restraint. The weight of discipline was palpable, and the audience felt it. A ripple of applause began at the edges of the room, hesitant at first, as though people weren't sure if they were supposed to clap. Then it grew, bold and uncontainable, until the entire audience erupted. The cheers rolled through the studio, breaking the silence with a force that was no longer Colbert's to command. And in that eruption, the tables turned. The applause wasn't for a clever joke. It wasn't for a rehearsed line. It was for truth spoken plainly, without performance, without apology. Colbert tried to laugh it off, leaning back in his chair, waving his hand as if to dismiss it. "Oh, come on," he said, voice laced with strained humor. "I think the people are still laughing with me." Denzel, but the crowd didn't laugh with him. The wave of applause didn't subside quickly, and the unease in his voice betrayed him. His usual rhythm set up, smirk, punchline, laughter was broken. He reached for a quip, but it fell flat, the timing off, the delivery hollow. Denzel, meanwhile, didn't chase the applause. He sat back, composed, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. His stillness made Colbert's fumbling even more obvious. For every word Colbert tried to squeeze in, Denzel answered with brevity, with calm wisdom that hung in the air long after the syllables ended. Colbert asked about Hollywood excess. Denzel replied, "Money doesn't change who you are, it reveals who you are." The audience murmured in agreement, nods replacing laughter. Colbert jabbed at the idea of faith in a cynical world. Denzel said, "I'd rather live by something eternal than chase what fades." Another burst of applause, this time without hesitation. The unraveling was visible. Colbert leaned harder into sarcasm, but each attempt seemed to dig him deeper. The harder he pushed, the more the audience sided with Denzel. It was no longer Colbert's show, was a lesson unfolding live. A shift in power so dramatic that even the cameras seemed to linger longer on Denzel's face than on Colbert's. And then came the moment that sealed it. Colbert, struggling to mask his frustration, asked with mock innocence, "So what, Denzel? Are you saying I'm a liar up here?" Denzel didn't rush his response. He let the words hang, let the silence swell again until the audience leaned forward, waiting. Then, with the same calm authority, he answered, "I'm saying truth doesn't need to hide behind a joke." The effect was electric. Gasps echoed across the room, followed by a thunder of applause that drowned out everything else. Colbert's face flushed, his smile collapsing into something forced and uncomfortable. For the first time, the man who always had the last word found himself without one. The camera caught it, the tightening of his jaw, the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, the way he shifted in his chair as though the ground beneath him had tilted. He chuckled again, a hollow sound, then glanced toward the audience, desperate for them to rescue him with laughter. But the laughter never came. Instead, the applause rolled on, long and loud, the kind reserved not for comedy, but for revelation. Denzel didn't gloat. He didn't press the advantage. He simply sat, composed, his presence speaking louder than any boast could. The audience could feel it. This was no performance. This was authenticity in its purest form, and it stood in stark contrast to the smirking facade they had grown accustomed to. Colbert attempted one last pivot, trying to steer the conversation back to safer ground, asking about an upcoming film. But the tension lingered, the imbalance clear. Every word he spoke seemed smaller now, less sharp, less commanding. And every time Denzel responded, it was with the kind of clarity that didn't need to be clever to be devastating. By the end of the segment, the verdict was undeniable. Colbert had been shut down not by volume, not by aggression, but by the quiet strength of a man who didn't need to play along. As the audience rose to their feet in a standing ovation, Colbert forced a smile and clapped along, but the defeat was written all over him. He had been outmatched, not in comedy, but in truth. And in that moment, dignity stood taller than comedy. The moment the cameras cut, the studio was still humming with the echo of what had just unfolded. But outside those walls, the shockwaves were only beginning. Within minutes, clips of Denzel's line were snatched, clipped, and blasted across social media. By the time the show even finished airing on the East Coast, hashtags were already catching fire. Hashtag Denzel wins, hashtag Colbert shut down, hashtag truth. The video spread like wildfire. 15 seconds of Denzel leaning in, eyes unwavering, words sharper than any monologue Colbert had ever scripted. Twitter feeds flooded with the clip, looping endlessly, every replay seeming more devastating than the last. Some fans slowed it down, adding dramatic music, turning the exchange into a mini-movie. Others froze on Colbert's frozen smile, captioning it with memes that mocked the moment his armor cracked. On Instagram, celebrities began weighing in. Actors, musicians, even politicians reposted the clip with their own takes. One called it the greatest late-night moment of the decade. Another wrote simply, "That's how you handle arrogance with grace." The consensus was clear. Denzel hadn't just won a debate. He had delivered something bigger, something that transcended entertainment. Meanwhile, TikTok took the moment and ran with it. Thousands of edits flooded the app, some comedic, some reverent. One viral video set the clip to the sound of a mic dropping. Another layered it with slow motion and thunder, as if the heavens themselves punctuated Denzel's words. Millions watched, shared, and stitched the clip, building an unstoppable wave of digital recognition. The press couldn't ignore it either. By the next morning, headlines screamed across news sites. Denzel Washington humiliates Colbert on live TV. When comedy meets truth and loses, cable news panels replayed the footage on loop, dissecting every detail, the timing, the expression on Colbert's face, the shift in audience energy. Analysts pointed out how rarely anyone managed to silence a host like Colbert on his own turf, and how extraordinary it was to see it done without a raised voice, without theatrics, just poise and precision. And the reactions split audiences in revealing ways. Denzel's supporters saw a hero standing tall, a man unwilling to be reduced to a punchline. They praised his composure, calling him a model of dignity in a media landscape addicted to noise. Comment sections overflowed with admiration. "That's what a real man looks like." Denzel showed the world that truth doesn't need a laugh track. On the other side, Colbert's fans scrambled to defend him, insisting he had been playing along, that the exchange was overblown. But their arguments rang hollow when stacked against the viral footage. Even among his defenders, there was an uncomfortable acknowledgement Colbert had been rattled, visibly shaken in a way that no clever edit could disguise. The cultural divide was obvious. To some, it was a night comedy lost its grip on power. To others, it was just an awkward TV moment blown out of proportion. But everyone, no matter their stance, agreed on one thing: the clip couldn't be unseen. By the week's end, the confrontation was more than a trending topic. Commentators began calling it a cultural reset. Think pieces poured out, exploring why the moment resonated so deeply. Some argued it was about truth versus spin, about the hunger for authenticity in a world of performance. Others said it symbolized a generational exhaustion, with mockery as a shield, with laughter as a weapon, to silence rather than enlighten. Even late night itself came under scrutiny. For years, these shows had been the cultural pulpit, shaping narrative through comedy and satire. But Denzel's quiet defiance cracked the illusion. He had shown that a guest could flip the script, that dignity could upstage sarcasm, and that an audience, even one primed for laughter, could be won over by truth. And yet, as powerful as the online frenzy was, the real impact wasn't confined to viral clips, memes, or headlines. It lingered in living rooms, in conversations at work, in classrooms and cafes where people replayed the moment not just for entertainment, but for meaning. Something deeper was stirring. Because what happened on that stage wasn't just a clash between a comedian and an actor. It was a reminder of a truth America had been trying to ignore. And that truth was about to come into focus. Step back for a moment. Beyond the applause, the memes, and the trending hashtags, what really happened that night? It wasn't just a celebrity clapback. It wasn't just a viral clip destined to fade into the endless churn of the internet. No, what unfolded was bigger, heavier. It was the collision of two forces that have been at war for decades in American culture. Comedy versus truth, arrogance versus dignity, noise versus wisdom. Stephen Colbert came armed with wit, sarcasm, and the safety net of a laughing audience. He was the embodiment of performance, of cleverness sharpened into a blade that had for years cut down anyone foolish enough to challenge him on his own turf. But comedy, when stripped of empathy, becomes something else. It becomes arrogance. It becomes a mask, and arrogance blinds. On the other side sat Denzel Washington, not with a smirk, not with a script, not with an arsenal of punchlines, but with something far more disarming. His power was not in volume but in presence. His words weren't spun to draw laughter but to reveal truth. He didn't need to win the audience with mockery, he won them with respect. And in doing so, he reminded everyone watching of something we've nearly forgotten in a culture obsessed with noise: dignity doesn't flinch under pressure. That is why his words landed with such force. They weren't flashy. They weren't cruel. They were grounded, measured, spoken with the weight of a man who had lived through struggle, built his life on discipline, and never once needed to trade truth for applause. And in that moment, America saw the contrast laid bare. The jester with all his tricks versus the man with nothing but authenticity. And the jester faltered. The lesson cuts deeper than late-night television. It speaks to who we are and what we value. For too long, we've let the loudest voices set the tone, mistaking sarcasm for insight, equating ridicule with strength. But strength isn't in tearing others down, it's in standing tall when the world tries to shrink you. Respect isn't earned by commanding laughter, it's earned by commanding silence, by making people listen even when it's uncomfortable. This is why Denzel's stance becomes universal. It wasn't just about him shutting down Colbert. What's about showing every person watching that you don't have to match arrogance with arrogance. You don't have to meet mockery with mockery. The higher ground still exists. Calm discipline still wins. Truth still matters. And this message, whether whispered in the quiet corners of homes or shouted across digital platforms, resonates because it touches something at the heart of the American story. At our best, we are a nation that believes in dignity. At our best, we honor those who rise not by crushing others but by holding fast to principle. At our best, we hunger for authenticity, for leaders and voices who speak not to impress but to illuminate. That night on Colbert's stage was a reminder of how fragile arrogance is and how unshakable truth can be. So when the dust settled, when the applause faded and the lights dimmed, the lasting image wasn't Colbert's smirk. It was Denzel's steady gaze, his calm delivery, his refusal to bow to performance. That's what people carried with them. That's what they replayed, not just for entertainment, but for inspiration. Because when the spotlight burns brightest, only truth can stand unshaken. Denzel Washington shuts down Colbert. That headline, now stamped across millions of feeds, captures the spectacle, but the truth goes deeper. What the world witnessed wasn't just a clash of personalities. It was a rare moment when dignity rose above arrogance, when calm wisdom silenced empty noise. In a culture drowning in sarcasm and spectacle, Denzel reminded us that real strength doesn't need to shout. Real authority doesn't lean on mockery. It stands firm, steady, and unshaken. That's why this moment hit like a lightning bolt. It wasn't about a celebrity tip down. It was about something every one of us craves: authenticity. So ask yourself, when arrogance fills the room, when noise drowns out reason, when the easy laugh comes at the cost of truth, who do you want to be? The one who smirks or the one who stands tall? If this moment moved you, don't let it vanish into the scroll of yesterday's clips. Share it, spread it. Let others see what happens when grace outshines mockery, when composure outlasts arrogance. And if you believe the world needs more stories like this, stories where truth triumphs over spectacle, where dignity defeats arrogance, join us here, where we keep the spotlight on the moments that remind us who we are at our best. Because the applause may have faded that night, but the echo of Denzel's words still lingers, whispering a truth louder than laughter, a lesson stronger than pride, and it will keep echoing so long as we carry it forward.